The Galactic Council summoned humanity, and silence consumed the entire universe. The message came in at 3:47 in the morning, ship time, and it had no subject line. I was not asleep. I had not been asleep in 19 hours. I was sitting at my console aboard the U's Endurance with cold coffee in one hand and a report about fuel efficiency in the other, and I was thinking about absolutely nothing important when the screen in front of me went white. Not flickered, not glitched, went white. The entire display surface from edge to edge filled with a single clean transmission bearing the seal of the Galactic Council. No preamble, no procedural header, no reference number, just the seal and beneath it 11 words. All recognized civilizations are required to attend an emergency session at the Cradle Nexus. I read it 3 times. The Galactic Council had been in existence for roughly 400,000 years, give or take a geological era. In all that time, they had never once sent a message this short. Council transmissions were legendary for being bloated, ceremonial, and slow. They came wrapped in layers of formal language, courtesy titles, species-specific honorifics, and enough procedural boilerplate to fill a small library. Reading a council transmission usually required a specialist. This one had 11 words. I set down the coffee. I set down the report. I pulled up the transmission log to verify that it had actually arrived through official channels and was not some kind of drill or mistake. It had. Verified, sealed, authenticated, sent simultaneously to every registered diplomatic vessel in the galaxy. I sat very still for about 30 seconds, listening to the hum of the Endurance around me. Then I woke up everyone on the ship. My name is Kara Lennox. I am 38 years old. I grew up in a small town in the English Midlands, studied xenolinguistics at Oxford, and spent the next 12 years working my way through increasingly strange corners of interstellar diplomacy until I somehow ended up here. Senior human liaison to the Galactic Council, occupying seat 47 of 47 aboard the most important diplomatic station in the known galaxy. Seat 47, the last seat, the one near the back where the lighting was slightly dimmer than everywhere else, and where the acoustics made it difficult to hear the front of the chamber without a translation earpiece. Humanity had held that seat for 6 years. Before that, we spent 30 years being told we were not ready for a seat at all. The Council had admitted us on what the Veldrath Elder Speaker called a provisional basis, which was a polite way of saying that 46 other civilizations had agreed to tolerate our presence as long as we did not cause problems. We had not caused problems. We had been very careful not to cause problems. We had attended every session, voted on every motion, filed every required report, and sat quietly in seat 47 while beings with 60,000 years of spaceflight experience talked about things that affected our species without particularly asking our opinion. 6 years of that will either make you patient or make you very, very tired. I was tired. But this morning at 3:47 ship time, something had changed. I could feel it even before I understood it. The message was too clean, too short, too urgent in a way that the Council never allowed itself to be, because urgency implied that something had gone wrong, and the Council preferred to project the image that nothing ever went wrong. Something had gone very wrong. My crew was small. That was deliberate. Humanity's Council allocation only permitted a liaison team of 7, a number that had been voted on by the other 46 species, and struck me as specifically calculated to be just large enough to be technically present and just small enough to be practically irrelevant. I had Oliver Brandt, my communications officer, who was 26 and from Edinburgh and could decode alien signal structures faster than anyone I had ever met. I had Dr. Priya Kapoor, my xenolinguist, who had 3 doctorates and the posture of someone who had spent too many years hunched over ancient texts. I had Felix Cole, my physicist, who was 44 and quiet, and had a habit of solving enormous problems on small pieces of paper. I had 3 others, a medic named Grace, a security officer named Dan, and a pilot named Lou who had been flying ships since before I finished secondary school. 7 humans, crossing the galaxy on a ship built for 40, heading toward a summons that had 11 words and no explanation. Oliver met me in the corridor outside the communications bay, still pulling on his jacket. "I checked the signal routing," he said. "It went to every registered vessel simultaneously. Same timestamp within nanoseconds. No priority markings, no encrypted secondary layer, no follow-up." "So they sent it and went quiet," I said. "Completely quiet," he said. "I have been monitoring the Council's standard broadcast frequency. Nothing. Not even the routine navigation updates they send every 6 hours." I looked at him, he looked at me. "How long has the frequency been silent?" I asked. He checked his tablet. "Since 4 minutes before the transmission arrived." I let that sit for a moment. The Galactic Council had never gone silent, not once in 400,000 years of operation. They broadcast continuously on their standard frequency: navigation warnings, session announcements, diplomatic bulletins, maintenance notices. It was constant and unremarkable, like a heartbeat. You stopped noticing it after a while. It was simply always there. It was not there now. "Get everyone to the briefing room," I said. "Now." I told them everything I knew, which was not much. I told them what the message said. I told them about the silence on the broadcast frequency. I told them that every other diplomatic vessel in the galaxy had received the same summons and was presumably making the same calculations we were. Grace, the medic, asked what I thought it was about. "I do not know," I said, which was true. Felix, the physicist, did not say anything. He was already writing on a small piece of paper. "Do we go?" Dan asked. He was the kind of person who asked practical questions, which I appreciated. "We go," I said. "We were summoned, we go." No one argued. That was one thing about small crews on long missions. You develop a kind of shared instinct. Everyone in that room had the same feeling I did, and the feeling was not fear exactly. It was the feeling you get when you are walking through a familiar building, and something is very slightly out of place, and you cannot identify what it is yet. Something was out of place. We were going to go find out what. I went back to my console and pulled up the star charts for the Cradle Nexus. It was 14 hours away at our current heading. I set a new course and watched the Endurance begin to turn in the dark. Then I did something that I had not planned to do. I opened the signal log and scrolled back through the past 48 hours of Council broadcasts, looking for anything unusual in the pattern before the silence. I found it in the 41st hour. It was a gap, barely noticeable. 2 seconds where the broadcast frequency had carried a different signal entirely, something that did not match any known Council format. It was not language. It was not mathematics in any notation I recognized. It was a pattern of pulses that my analysis software flagged as unknown origin and declined to categorize. 2 seconds, buried in 48 hours of routine traffic. If I had not been looking for something wrong, I would never have found it. I saved the file. I labeled it with a timestamp. I sent a copy to Felix without explanation. 20 minutes later, he knocked on my door and held up his piece of paper. On it, he had written 3 words. "It is old." "How old?" I asked. He considered this. "Older than the Council," he said, "possibly much older." I looked out the small viewport beside my desk. The stars were the same as they always were, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to anything we were feeling. "Get some sleep," I told him. "We have 14 hours." He nodded and left. I did not sleep. I sat at my desk and I read everything I could find about the Cradle Nexus, about the history of Galactic Council emergency sessions, about the kinds of events that had historically required every civilization to stop what it was doing and come together in one place. The list was short. Most entries were about resource crises or territorial disputes, the kind of things that were serious but manageable. At the very bottom of the list, in a footnote so small it looked like an afterthought, there was a single reference to an event from 11 million years ago. The footnote simply said, Pre-Council. No details. I stared at that footnote for a long time. Then the Endurance crossed into the approach corridor for the Cradle Nexus, and the station came into view through the forward viewport. It was enormous. It was always enormous. A structure built over hundreds of thousands of years by dozens of civilizations, a sprawling, layered thing that glittered against the dark. I had docked here 17 times. I knew its shape the way you know a city you have lived in. But tonight the outer observation rings were dark. Every time I had approached this station, those rings had been lit. Thousands of windows, dozens of species moving through the corridors, the constant slow rotation of a place that never stopped working. Tonight nothing. No lights, no movement. The observation rings were completely dark, as if someone had switched off every single light at exactly the same moment. Oliver appeared in the doorway. I am picking up 46 other vessels in the docking queue, he said. Every council species is here. Good, I said. Kara, he said, and his voice had something in it that made me stop. I am also picking up something on the edge of the sensor range. It is not one of ours. It is not any design I have in the database. It is just sitting there, not moving, not broadcasting, just sitting. I turned from the viewport. How big? I asked. He looked at his screen. I cannot get a clean reading, he said. The sensor return keeps coming back wrong, like it is too big for the sensors to frame correctly. I looked back out at the dark observation rings. Dock us, I said quietly, and keep that sensor running. The Endurance moved toward the Cradle Nexus, small and quiet and very, very human, and behind us in the dark. Something that was not on any chart and not in any database simply waited, patient as stone, patient as something that has been waiting for a very long time and is in absolutely no hurry. We docked. The airlock opened. I picked up my bag and I walked toward the chamber where 46 other civilizations were already waiting, and I did not yet know that by the time I walked back out of that room, everything in the universe would be different. But I think some part of me already suspected. The chamber doors were already open when we arrived. That was the first wrong thing. Council chamber doors were never open before a session. It was one of those procedural details that every diplomat learned in the first week. The doors remained sealed until the presiding speaker gave the formal signal. Then they opened once together, and all delegations entered simultaneously. It was ceremonial. It was deliberate. It was the council's way of saying that no species arrived before any other. The doors were open. Some delegations were already inside. No signal had been given. I walked in. The chamber was enormous, circular, layered with tiers of seating that curved upward and inward like the inside of a shell. Each species had its designated section, its console, its translation interface. The lighting was always the same, steady, neutral, designed to be comfortable for the widest possible range of biological vision. Tonight the lighting was slightly lower than usual, not dramatically, just enough that the room felt different, felt closer, felt like somewhere that the air had gotten heavier while no one was watching. I found seat 47 and sat down. Across the chamber, the Veldrath delegation had already taken their places. The Veldrath were crystalline beings, tall and slow-moving, with a quality of presence that made every room feel smaller. They were the oldest member species of the Council, with a recorded spaceflight history of 60,000 years. When a Veldrath elder spoke, the room listened, not because of protocol, but because of the simple weight of everything they represented. The elder speaker was already in her seat. She was not speaking to anyone. She was looking at the center of the chamber floor. I followed her gaze. There was nothing there, just the floor. But she was looking at it very carefully. The Soon Collective arrived next, their delegation moving in the perfectly synchronized way of a hive species. 23 individuals settling into their section, as if operated by a single thought. The Orath Dominion came in behind them, larger and louder, 4 representatives in ceremonial dress, the kind they only wore for sessions of formal gravity. Everyone was arriving. I watched them come in and I watched their faces, or what passed for faces, and what I saw was the same on every species. They were afraid. Not panicked, nothing so obvious, but there is a way that intelligent beings carry fear when they have had time to think about it. It settles into the body differently from fresh shock. It becomes quiet, becomes still. The Veldrath Elder was completely still. The Soong Collective had stopped making the small, ambient sounds they usually made. The Orath representatives were sitting perfectly straight, which for their species was the equivalent of holding their breath. They all knew something. They had all been told something, or worked something out, something that I had not been told and had not yet worked out. I opened my translation earpiece and connected it to the chamber feed. Oliver was at the station's external comms hub, monitoring everything he could reach. I sent him a short message, anything on the outside sensor. His reply came back in 30 seconds, still there, still not moving. The doors closed. The elder speaker rose. There was no formal introduction, no reading of the session register, no recitation of the protocols. She simply stood, and the chamber went quiet so fast it felt like a physical event, like a pressure change. "What I am about to tell you," she said, in the common tongue, "has been known to the senior member species for 9 hours. We chose to tell no one until all delegations were present, because we did not want this information moving through open channels before we could contain the response to it." She paused. 11 million years ago, she said, a civilization existed in this galaxy that was older than any of us by a measure we do not have adequate language to describe. They built the infrastructure that underlies everything we use, the relay networks, the stable corridors, the anchor points around every inhabited system. They built all of it and then they withdrew. They left no instructions and made no contact. We have called them in various languages by various names. The most common translation is the architects. No one moved. 6 days ago, the elder speaker continued, a signal was detected on a frequency that has been silent for 11 million years. It was not random. It was not residual. It was deliberate, targeted, and structured. It was directed at this galaxy, at every species in it. It was a message from the architects. The silence in the chamber was total. The message has been analyzed by every senior translation team available to us. The Soong Collective has run 437 separate decoding attempts. The Orath Institute of Signal Study has contributed 17 independent analyses. Our own Veldrath linguistic archives, which include records older than this council, have been searched completely. She looked around the room. For a moment her gaze crossed my section. I had the distinct impression she was not really seeing me. "The best translation we have been able to produce," she said, "is this: account for yourselves." 3 words. That was the message from a civilization older than recorded history. Account for yourselves. The chamber stayed silent for about 4 seconds. Then it did not. The Orath senior representative was on his feet immediately. His voice carried the deep resonance of his species, trained for command, trained for declaration. He said that the Orath Dominion did not accept the premise that any external authority had the right to demand an account from a sovereign civilization. He said this with considerable volume. The Soong Collective's lead speaker, a female representative named Isha, raised her hand and began citing probability models. Her voice was precise and fast. She said the statistical likelihood of a message of this complexity being benign was 14%. She said that the appropriate response was defensive positioning and signal blackout. 2 other species began speaking at the same time. The translation system struggled. I caught fragments of arguments about precedent, about sovereignty, about the history of first contact scenarios, about what the message might actually mean, and whether account was even the right translation or whether there was a better word, a less threatening word, a word that might make the whole thing feel more manageable. I sat in seat 47 and listened, and I thought about the 2-second signal Felix had found buried in 48 hours of routine traffic. It is old, he had said. Older than the council, possibly much older. 11 million years older, as it turned out. I thought about the thing sitting at the edge of the sensor range, that was too large for the sensors to frame correctly. I thought about account for yourselves, and I thought about what that meant, and what it did not mean, and what kind of entity would phrase a message that way, and what kind of response they might be expecting. The arguments in the chamber were getting louder. The elder speaker was attempting to restore order and not quite succeeding. The Orath representative was gesturing with considerable force. The Soon Collective had gone very still in the way that meant they were running calculations at full capacity. No one was asking the question that I was sitting in seat 47 thinking about very hard. I raised my hand. No one noticed. I raised it again higher and activated my console's signal flag, which sent a small notification to the presiding panel that the delegation at seat 47 wished to speak. It was ignored for a while. That was normal. Then the elder speaker glanced at my section and paused mid-sentence. "The human delegation has flagged for comment," she said, in a tone that suggested she was acknowledging this mostly out of procedural obligation. Every face in the chamber turned toward me. I was used to this. I was never not aware of being in seat 47, of being the youngest species in the room by a margin that was not close. "Thank you," I said. "I have one question." "Proceed," the elder speaker said. "Account for what?" I said. The chamber was quiet. "The message says account for yourselves," I said, "but it does not say what it is asking us to account for. Our existence, our history, our choices, our intentions. Before we decide how to respond or whether to respond, it seems important to understand what the question is actually asking. Because right now we are arguing about how to answer something that we have not yet agreed we understand." The elder speaker looked at me for a long moment. "That," she said slowly, "is the question we have been unable to answer." "Then that is the question we should be working on," I said. Another silence, shorter this time. Then the Orath representative said, with less volume than before, "The human has a point." It was, in my 6 years at the Galactic Council, the first time an Orath representative had said that about anything a human had said. I noted it. I also noted that the elder speaker was still looking at me with an expression I could not fully read. The session was called to recess 20 minutes later. I was gathering my things when someone touched my arm. I turned. It was the Veldrath historian. I knew her from previous sessions. Her name, in the approximation the translation system gave, was something like Elindra. She was older than most of the Veldrath present, which meant she was very old indeed. She moved slowly. She always moved slowly. "Dr. Lennox," she said very quietly, "a word." I followed her into the corridor. "You asked the right question," she said, "but I want you to understand something before you pursue it too far." She paused. "The architects sent a message 11 million years ago. At that time, a species called the Dawnborn received it. They responded. They were never found again. The common understanding is that they were erased." I looked at her. "The common understanding," she said, "is not necessarily correct. But I want you to know that before the Dawnborn disappeared, they had been in space for 40 million years. They were not young. They were not inexperienced. And they answered the architect's message." "What did they say?" I asked. Elindra looked at me steadily. "We do not know," she said. "That is the part of the record that is missing. We know they answered. We know what happened afterward. We do not know what they said." She turned and walked slowly back toward the chamber. I stood in the corridor and looked at the wall and thought about a species that had been in space for 40 million years, that had heard the same message we were now hearing, that had answered it, and that had then simply ceased to exist. 40 million years. We had been in space for 60. I went back inside. The first hour after the recess told me everything I needed to know about how the next stage of this would go, and none of it was encouraging. The council had a plan. The elder speaker presented it with the kind of careful formality that indicated it had been agreed upon before the session opened, probably by the senior species in a private conversation that humanity had not been invited to. The plan was silence. Complete, total, deliberate silence. No response to the architect's message. No signal of any kind on any frequency. Every vessel would reduce to minimal broadcast emissions. Every colony, every station, every installation would go dark to the extent possible. The idea was to present the galaxy as empty, as quiet, as something that the architects might overlook or move past or simply stop paying attention to. The architects have waited 11 million years between messages, the elder speaker said. It is reasonable to assume that their concept of time is not our concept of time. If we produce no signal for them to engage with, there is a possibility they will withdraw. I sat in seat 47 and listened to this. The vote was called. 46 marks went up. I was watching the display counter, watching it climb toward 47, and then it stopped at 46 and the counter held there because my hand was not up. The elder speaker looked at my section. The human delegation has not voted, she said. I am aware, I said. The motion requires unanimous agreement to become binding on all member species. I am aware of that too, I said. Are you abstaining, or do you intend to vote against? I looked around the chamber. 46 species. Some of them had been in space before humanity learned to write. Some of them had technologies we were still trying to understand. Every single one of them had just voted to hide. I am abstaining, I said. The silence that followed was of a different quality from all the silences before it. Those had been heavy with fear or shock. This one was different. This one had something sharp in it. May I ask the reason for the abstention? The elder speaker said, and her voice was careful in a way that told me she very much wanted to handle this correctly. I do not yet have enough information to vote either way, I said. I think that before we decide to say nothing, we should make absolutely certain we understand what saying nothing will cost us. I am not comfortable voting for silence when I do not know what the alternative to silence looks like. The alternative, the Orath representative said, his voice back to its full volume, is provoking an entity capable of erasing a civilization that was in space for 40 million years. Or, I said, the alternative is answering a question correctly. I do not know which. That is why I am abstaining. No one spoke. The motion passes with 46 votes, the elder speaker said. The human delegation's abstention is noted in the record. The council will now move to implementation of the silence protocol. She looked at me one more time, and this time I could read the expression. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was something closer to worry. The session ended. I walked out of the chamber with Oliver, who had been sitting at the observation bench behind me, and we did not speak until we were back aboard the Endurance with the door closed. Then Felix appeared from the direction of the science bay holding a piece of paper and looking more awake than he had any right to look after 19 hours without sleep. I found something, he said. In the carrier frequency of the architect's signal, there is a mathematical structure embedded in it. It is not random and it is not decoration. He held up the paper. It was covered in small, dense notation. It is a response template. They did not just ask a question. They built a mechanism for receiving an answer. They left the door open. I took the paper. I looked at it. I looked at Oliver. I looked at Felix. Show me everything, I said. We went to the science bay, and Felix walked me through it for 2 hours. By the end of it, I understood enough to be certain of 3 things. First, the architects had not sent a threat. They had sent a test. Second, the test had a correct answer. It was not a riddle with a trick solution. It was a genuine question with a genuine expected response. Account for yourselves. Tell us what you are. Honestly. Completely. Third, there was a response window. The template Felix had found had a timing structure built into it. It was not a hard deadline, but it was a window, and it was open now, and it would not stay open indefinitely. I sat with those three things for a long time. Then I thought about the Dawnborn, 40 million years in space, and they had answered, and they were gone. Why were they gone? What had they said? The record was missing, the answer was missing. But what kind of answer would cause an entity like the architects to erase a civilization that had been traveling the stars for 40 million years? An entity that had built the infrastructure the whole galaxy ran on. An entity that had waited 11 million years before speaking again. What would make something like that react with destruction? I thought about it from every angle I had. And then I thought about something else, about what the Veldrath historian had said. The common understanding is not necessarily correct. She had not said the Dawnborn were erased. She had said they were never found again, and she had said the common understanding was that they were erased. But what if the common understanding was wrong? What if the Dawnborn had not been destroyed? What if they had simply been sent away, quarantined, separated from the galaxy because their answer had disqualified them from something? What would an answer look like that would disqualify a civilization? I had a thought. It arrived slowly and it was uncomfortable and I did not like it, but it arrived anyway and I could not make it leave. A lie, a perfect, polished, careful lie. A civilization presenting itself as something better than it was, hiding its failures, hiding its cruelties, packaging itself as worthy, performing wisdom it did not actually possess. What kind of entity that had built the foundation of a whole galaxy would have the least patience for that? What would they do with a species that, when asked to account for itself, presented a portrait of perfection instead of truth? I sat with that thought until it stopped being uncomfortable and became something else. Became obvious. I opened a new file on my console. I started writing. It was not a diplomatic document. It was not formatted according to any council standard. It was not careful or measured or designed to present humanity in a favorable light. It was an accounting, a real one, everything we were, everything we had done. The things we were proud of and the things we were not, the centuries of conflict, the damage we had done to our own world before we figured out how to stop, the arguments we were still having, the problems we had not solved, the things we were still getting wrong. I wrote for 4 hours without stopping. Oliver knocked on my door at some point. I told him to go to sleep. He did not go to sleep. He sat in the chair by the door and read his tablet and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Felix came by. I showed him what I was writing. He read the first 3 pages, handed it back, and said, "Yes," just the one word. I kept writing. When I was finished, I read it back once. It was not beautiful. It was not what any council diplomat would have produced. It was honest. It was completely, uncomfortably, specifically honest. I connected my console to the council's primary transmitter through a secondary access code that I technically had authorization to use, but had never used before. I put my finger over the transmit key. I thought about the Dawnborn. I thought about Seat 47. I thought about every human being who ever stood at the edge of something frightening, and decided that going forward was better than going back. I pressed the key. The signal went out at 4:22 in the morning, ship time, traveling at maximum broadcast power on every available frequency, clear and loud and unmistakably human. The response template Felix had identified began to activate the moment our signal reached it. I could see it on the display. The carrier frequency changed. The mathematical structure reorganized. Oliver appeared in my doorway, wide-eyed, tablet in hand. "Every console on the Nexus just lit up simultaneously," he said. I know, I said. The architect's signal has changed, he said. It is not a question anymore. I know, I said. It is addressed, he said, and he stopped and looked at his tablet and then looked at me, specifically to humanity, only to us. I looked at the screen. The response was already being processed through the translation framework Felix had built over the past several hours. Words were forming, slowly, imperfectly, but forming. I read the first line. Then I read it again. Then I turned to Oliver and I said, "Get everyone up. Get the elder speaker. Get all of them." "What does it say?" he asked. "It says," I told him, "that we are the first ones in a very long time who told the truth." The council chamber that morning looked nothing like it had the night before. It still had the same seats, the same tiers, the same neutral lighting. But the people in it were different, not in the sense that anyone had been replaced. Different in the sense that something had shifted inside each of them, the way a room looks different after a storm has passed through, even if nothing has moved. I stood at the speaking point in the center of the chamber floor. I had not been invited to stand there. The speaking point was reserved for presiding speakers and formally recognized presenters. I had simply walked to it and stood there, and no one had told me to move, which was itself remarkable. The architect's message was a test, I said. Not a threat, not an ultimatum, a test. And the test had a specific and consistent format that has apparently been in use for a very long time. I looked around the room. Every civilization that reaches a certain point of development receives it. Account for yourselves. It is the same message every time. The question is always the same, only the answers change. Isha, the Soon Collective's lead speaker, said, "What constitutes a passing answer?" "Honesty," I said. "Silence." The architects built this galaxy's infrastructure. They seeded the conditions for life across hundreds of thousands of systems. And what they want to know, when a civilization gets large enough to matter, is whether that civilization understands itself. Not whether it is perfect. Not whether it has solved all its problems. Whether it is honest about what it is. Whether it can look at its own history without flinching from the parts that are hard. The Orath senior representative, whose name I had learned was Commander Verath, said slowly, "The Dawnborn were erased because they did not answer honestly." "The Dawnborn were not erased," I said. The room went very still. The architect's response includes a reference to them. They were not destroyed. They were separated, quarantined, preserved in an isolated system still existing, having never grown beyond the version of themselves that they presented in their answer, a version that was not true. I paused. The architect's translation, as best Felix has been able to render it, is something like, "We keep what cannot account for itself so that it does not spread." I let that land. Verath said very quietly, "They are still alive." "They have been alive for 11 million years," I said, "in an isolated system, exactly as they described themselves when they answered. Frozen, in a sense, at the moment of their lie." Elindra, the Veldrath historian, had not moved from her seat, but her expression was the most open I had ever seen a Veldrath expression be. She said, "And we, if we had implemented the silence protocol, if we had refused to answer." The response template had a timing structure, Felix said, from the observer bench. He was holding his piece of paper. It was not a hard deadline, but the architects were already registering our silence as a response. If we had maintained it long enough, they would have classified us all the same way. "As what?" Isha asked. "As civilizations not ready to account for themselves," Felix said. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Verath stood. He was tall. His people were built for presence. But the way he stood now was not the aggressive posture I had seen from him in the previous session. He stood the way someone stands when they have just put something down that was very heavy. "I have a question for Dr. Lennox," he said. I looked at him. "Your account," he said. "The one you transmitted. I have had a partial translation prepared in the last hour." He paused. It includes references to conflicts that killed significant portions of your own population. It includes the period during which your species was actively destroying the climate of your home world. It includes ongoing disputes that remain unresolved. It includes things your people have done that you are clearly not proud of. Yes, I said. And this passed, he said. This was the correct answer. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. My people have been in space for 9,000 years, he said. In that time we have fought wars that we do not put in our official histories. We have made decisions that we have classified and sealed and agreed not to discuss. We have presented ourselves to this council, and to every species we have encountered, as something more consistently honorable than we have always been. He looked at me steadily. I would like, he said, to submit our own accounting. Isha stood almost simultaneously. The Soon Collective will require assistance. We have not historically distinguished between what is true and what is strategically optimal to present. We will need guidance on the distinction. I looked at both of them. I looked around the chamber. At 46 species, each one older than us, each one carrying something they had been holding very carefully for a very long time. We will help, I said, all of us together. Elindra caught my eye from across the chamber. She nodded once. Slow, deliberate, the kind of nod that comes from a very old being who has just seen something they did not expect to see. The architect's signal pulsed once more while I was standing there. This time it was not directed at humanity alone. It went to every corner of the galaxy simultaneously, wide and clear and open. Not a question this time, not addressed to any single species. It was a different kind of signal entirely, and when Felix processed it through the translation framework, the rendering that came back was 3 words. The door is open. That was all, 3 words. But they were the right 3 words, because doors that are open can be walked through, and we were all still standing here, which meant there was still time, and time was something that the architects had apparently demonstrated they had a great deal of. I walked back to seat 47. Then I stopped. I turned around. I walked to a different seat, one near the front in the central tier, and I sat down in it. It did not belong to any species. It was a spare seat, one of the empty places that the chamber had in excess. No one said anything. I opened my console and started working. 3 months later, I sat in my kitchen in a small house in the English Midlands, which I had not seen in 2 years, and I tried to write a report that would accurately convey everything that had happened. I had been trying for 11 days. The problem was not that I did not know what to say. The problem was that everything I wrote sounded too small for what it actually was. My words kept failing to carry the weight of it. I tried a different approach. I stopped trying to explain the significance and just wrote the events. Here is what happened in order. We went to the Cradle Nexus because a civilization from 11 million years ago sent us 3 words. We sat in a room with 46 other species and discovered that all of them were afraid. We learned that the correct response to an 11 million-year-old question was honesty, and that honesty was apparently the rarest thing in the galaxy. We transmitted a true account of who we are, with all the difficulty and contradiction that involves, and it worked, not because we were special, but because we were willing to be honest about the fact that we were not. After that, things changed, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that real change always happens, which is messily and with setbacks and with a great deal of argument along the way. 43 of the 47 council species submitted accountings over the following months. Some of them took weeks. Some required multiple attempts. The Soon Collective's first draft was so precisely and carefully worded that Felix said it read like a legal document designed to reveal nothing. They had to throw it out and start again. The second draft took 3 weeks and was harder for them to write, and it passed. The Orath Dominion's accounting was the most difficult to witness. It took 11 weeks. 3 separate delegations composed and scrapped and restarted. Commander Vereth sent me a message at one point that said simply, "We did not know how much we had been carrying." I sent back, "I know, it gets easier, not the carrying, the putting it down." His response took 3 days to arrive. It said, "Thank you." The architect's archives opened gradually in sections, keyed to the submission of each species accounting. It was not a reward exactly. It was more like a natural consequence, a library that had been waiting for the right kind of visitor. The navigation charts alone contained information that would take decades to fully process. The infrastructure schematics were more complex than anything any current species had produced. There were records in there of civilizations that had risen and ended before any of our species existed, whole histories of the galaxy that no one living had known about. Oliver spent most of the 3 months at the Nexus, working with a translation team that included 3 Veldrath specialists and 2 members of the Soon Collective, processing everything they could access. He sent me updates every few days. The updates were getting longer. Felix went home to teach. He said he had enough new material for a decade of lectures. I believed him. Priya Kapoor published the first academic paper on the architect's language structure 6 weeks after the session. It was immediately the most read paper in the history of xenolinguistics. She told me later that the reviews were interesting, in that half of them praised the methodology and the other half accused her of fabricating the data. "They will come around," she said. "They always do." Elindra sent me a message 2 months after the session. It was long, which was unusual. Veldrath communications were typically brief. She told me that she had been working on something for a very long time, a history of the Veldrath that included the parts they had kept out of the official record. She said that writing it had been the most difficult thing she had done in her life, and she was very old, so that meant something. She said that she had read my accounting before she finished writing it, not to copy from it, but because she said it reminded her that truth, even when it is uncomfortable, does not break the thing it describes. She said, "It just makes it more real, and real things last." I thought about that for a long time. There was one more thing, and it was the thing I had been saving because it was the thing that changed everything for me personally. Not the session, not the accountings, not the opening of the archives. This. 6 weeks after the session, Felix sent me an update from the archive access team. They had found a section of the records that appeared to deal specifically with the Dawnborn. A full account, from the architect's perspective, of what had happened 11 million years ago. It was still being translated, but one section had come through clearly. The Dawnborn were alive. They had been alive this whole time. 11 million years in an isolated system, preserved and separate, exactly as they had described themselves in their answer. Frozen at the moment of their dishonesty, unable to grow beyond it, because the version of themselves they had presented was a version that had no room to grow. It was already perfect. It had no cracks for change to get through. The architects had not punished them. They had simply taken them at their word. And when humanity's accounting arrived, with all its cracks and arguments and unfinished business, the architects had apparently noted, in a section of the response that Felix translated as close to this as he could get, "Here is something that knows it is not finished." That was what passed. Not goodness, not wisdom, not achievement, not power. The simple, difficult knowledge that we were not finished, that we were still in the process of becoming something, and we knew it, and we were not pretending otherwise. I sat in my kitchen in the English Midlands and looked out the window at the garden and the sky above it, gray and ordinary, and entirely beautiful in the way that ordinary things are beautiful when you have been far away from them. I thought about seat 47. I thought about the way the chamber had looked that second morning, with 46 species all looking toward the human section, not the way they used to look at us, with tolerance or condescension, but with something else. Something I was still learning to name. I thought about Vereth saying, "We did not know how much we were carrying." I thought about Elindra saying real things last. I thought about Oliver at the Nexus, working through records that no one had touched in 11 million years, finding things that the whole galaxy needed to know. I thought about Felix's 3 words, written on a small piece of paper. It is old. Older than the Council, possibly much older. Old enough to have waited. Old enough to have built an entire galaxy's infrastructure and then stepped back and watched what grew in it, and sent one question to every civilization that grew large enough to hear it. Account for yourselves. And we had, and we were still here, and the door was open. I picked up my pen, and I tried one more time to write the report. This time, I did not try to explain the significance. I just wrote what happened. All of it. The uncomfortable parts included. The parts where I was not sure I made the right decision. The parts where I was afraid. The part where I sat alone in a communications bay at 4 in the morning and put my hand on a transmit key and thought about every human being who ever walked toward something frightening instead of away from it. I wrote it all down, honestly, completely. When I was finished, I read it back once. Then I thought, yes, that sounds like us. And I sent it.